There's a certain kind of smile people get when they think back to school in Britain back in the 1960s. The smell of chalk dust, the sound of polished shoes on waxed floors, the rustle of exercise books, and that slight nervous feeling when a teacher cleared their throat and the entire room snapped to attention. Children learn things at 9 years old that most adults wouldn't attempt now. Not because they were harder, but because they required patience, precision, and a special blend of quiet discipline and stubborn pride that every child simply accepted as part of growing up. Here are the lessons British children once took for granted, all taught in real schools, to real children, many as young as 8, that would leave today's students completely speechless. Number 1. Needlework for girls. If you were a girl at school in the 60s, you learned to sew whether you wanted to or not. It wasn't a club or a hobby. It was a subject, needlework, and it appeared on the timetable like maths or geography. You sat at long wooden tables with the afternoon light coming through high classroom windows, needles glinting, fingers pricked, and threads in colors that all looked faintly dusty. At 9 or 10 years old, you were already expected to hem a skirt, sew on buttons securely enough to withstand playground chaos, and darn socks until the hole practically disappeared. There was no talk of throwing it away and buying a new one. Waste was offensive. Repairing was respectable. Mending something properly wasn't just a skill, it was a moral duty. Girls learned neatness, patience, and how to unpick a seam while muttering under their breath. And no one dared knot a thread twice. That was a sign of sloppy work. A teacher would appear at your shoulder, arch an eyebrow, and the whole room would know. Back to the beginning. Number 2. Woodwork for boys. Meanwhile, the boys marched off to woodwork, as if the school had decided that one day they might be called to build a shed before tea. At around 10 or 11, boys learned to handle saws, chisels, hand drills, and files, real tools, heavy tools, tools that could quite easily remove a finger if enthusiasm outpaced skill. You shaved pieces of pine, created joints, sanded planks until your hands felt like sandpaper too, and proudly carried home slightly wonky bookshelves that parents displayed as if they were priceless antiques. The scent of sawdust filled the workshop, and somewhere, a boy would be blowing on a tiny splinter in his thumb, pretending it didn't hurt because pain was considered character building. Number 3. Domestic science. Domestic science sounded very grand. In reality, it meant learning how to boil potatoes properly and scrub a sink until it shone like polished silver. Girls, not boys of course, tied on aprons, washed their hands under icy taps, and learned how to peel carrots, iron pillowcases, wash clothes by hand, and serve food without slopping gravy over the edge of the dish. You learned kitchen safety, but not with TikTok videos and colorful posters. You learned by being told sternly to hold the knife correctly and not drop anything on your foot. A 12-year-old could make jam tarts, custard, stew, and bread pudding, and every lesson ended the same way, with washing up and wiping every surface until the teacher could see her reflection. Today, there are professional cleaning influencers. In the 60s, the influencers were your teachers, and they didn't do gentle encouragement. Number 4. Drill and marching. School drill was not PE, it was closer to light military training, only without the medals at the end. Children lined up in the yard in neat rows, backs straight, arms swinging in strict rhythm, knees lifting with purpose. The headmaster watched with his hands behind his back as a whistle cut the cold morning air. It wasn't exercise for health, it was exercise for order, for posture, for discipline. And every child, boys and girls, marched like a tiny regiment, not entirely sure what victory they were preparing for, but certain they'd better not fall out of step. Today, children stretch with yoga mats and calming music. Back then, you marched until you could almost hear your grandparents nodding in approval. Number 5. Elocution and courtesy. In some schools, especially grammar schools, speaking properly wasn't just encouraged, it was assessed. You were taught how to stand, how to greet adults, how to say good morning with clarity, how to pronounce consonants crisply, and how to speak without mumbling or slouching. Politeness was a language in itself. You learned to hold doors, to wait your turn, to address teachers formally, and to write thank you notes as though the future of civilization depended on stationery. Elocution lessons weren't about sounding posh, they were about sounding correct. You didn't say yeah, you said yes, and you certainly didn't interrupt. Today, teachers celebrate finding your voice. In the 60s, the goal was learning to use your voice properly, quietly, respectfully, and preferably only when spoken to. Number 6. Penmanship and ink discipline. Children today swipe screens. Children back then dipped pens into inkwells and prayed the ink wouldn't blot halfway through a sentence. Penmanship was serious business. Letters were loops and lines, tails and tops, painstaking curves that had to match the copybook exactly. A single ink blot could ruin an entire page. Blotting paper sat nearby like a silent judge. Handwriting was beauty and order on a page, not a race to finish. If your script slanted the wrong way, you fixed it. If you smudged your sleeve, you accepted the consequences. Some children carried little blue ink stains on their fingers like badges of honor. Good handwriting meant you were careful, diligent, and thoughtful. Messy handwriting meant disgrace. Or worse, being asked to start again. Number 7. Metalwork. If woodwork smelled of pine, metalwork smelled of heat, oil, and the faint metallic tang of iron filings. Boys, again only boys, learned to file brass, bend tin sheets, shape aluminium, and polish metal until it gleamed like chrome on a brand new Mini. Safety goggles existed, but enthusiasm for wearing them varied. Sparks flew, hands smudged black with grease, and every boy secretly hoped he'd be allowed to use the blowtorch. Even if your creation resembled a slightly confused paperweight, you displayed it proudly. And teachers expected pride. Pride in effort, pride in craft, pride in producing something solid, something real. Number 8. School gardening. Many schools had gardens and children learned how to tend them. Not watering houseplants, actual garden beds and vegetable plots. You dug soil, planted seeds, weeded rows, and waited. There was no instant reward. You learned patience the way nature intended, slowly. Some schools kept chickens, some grew potatoes or beans. And when something finally sprouted, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing your small hands had helped coax life from the ground. It was less horticulture unit and more, this is how you feed a nation if you ever have to. Number 9. Typing. Around the age of 12 or 13, many children, especially girls, were introduced to the glorious clatter of the manual typewriter. The keys were heavy, the ribbon ink smudged, and every letter came with a satisfying thunk. Fingers had to stretch and strike with purpose. There was no backspace, only correction fluid and regret. Learning the typewriter keyboard was considered a proper skill, useful for future employment, often meaning secretarial work. But whether you were destined for office life or not, typing lessons instilled rhythm, focus, and a surprising amount of upper arm strength. Number 10. Scripture and moral instruction. Once a week, children gathered their hymn books, straightened their collars, and prepared to read scripture. It wasn't optional. Lessons touched on Bible stories, proper conduct, and what it meant to be a good person and a good neighbor. Teachers spoke about honesty, humility, patience, and community. There was an unspoken rule that you behaved not just because you must, but because it was right. Today, moral lessons come from storybooks and assemblies. Back then, they came from the book of Proverbs, and a teacher who would not hesitate to pause mid-verse to raise an eyebrow at anyone whispering. Number 11. Nature study. Before science became whiteboards and highlighters, it was nature study. Children examined leaves, sketched feathers, observed caterpillars, and pressed wildflowers between book pages. Every child knew the names of birds, trees, and flowers in the school grounds. You learned the cycle of seasons, the life of a tadpole, and the sound of bees in summer. It wasn't about tests. It was about knowing the world around you, a world you were expected to respect, not scroll past. Number 12. Housecraft and laundry skills. Some schools took domestic training so seriously that children learned proper laundry care, how to soak, scrub, rinse, wring, and hang clothing. Ironing, folding, and even starching collars were considered essential life lessons. A 12-year-old girl could starch a shirt so sharply it could practically stand up by itself. It wasn't glamorous, but there was pride in it. Order and cleanliness weren't just preferences, they were virtues. Number 13. Practical maths and household budgeting. Before financial literacy became a headline topic, children in the 60s learned practical budgeting as naturally as times tables. At around 11 or 12, you might be given an imaginary weekly wage and told to plan meals, account for rent, allocate savings, and set aside money for emergencies. There were no calculators, just paper, pencil, and the quiet realization that life required careful planning, and occasionally deciding whether your imaginary family could afford jam. Number 14. Classroom duties. Every child had jobs. Real jobs. You fetched chalk, filled inkwells, cleaned blackboards, stacked hymn sheets, tidied shelves, and organized cloakrooms. Responsibility wasn't a reward. It was expected. Being trusted with tasks made you stand a little taller and take school just a little more seriously. And nothing felt quite as satisfying as wiping the board perfectly clean and hearing the teacher say, "Well done." Looking back now, it's easy to smile at the routines and rituals, the strictness and the strange logic of it all. But there was something undeniably grounding about those lessons. They connected children to the world, to real skills, to shared habits, to community, to discipline, and to a sense of growing up that felt deliberate and steady. We didn't call it character building then. It was simply school. A place where you learned not only how to read and write, but how to sew, fix, polish, plant, plan, speak, and behave. And even now, decades later, those memories aren't just about education. They are about identity, about the values quietly shaped in sunlit classrooms and chilly schoolyards. So when someone says, "School was different back then," they're right. It wasn't easier or harder, just rooted in a time when childhood had its own rhythm, and learning came with thread, ink, chalk, soil, steel, and a teacher's nod of quiet approval. And if you ever did manage to make a decent wooden bookend, sew a straight hem, or take a marching corner in perfect formation, well, that feeling never really leaves you, does it?